Hey guys, today we're stepping inside a Viking longhouse, and yes, you probably won't survive this. Not because you'll be chopped down in a raid, but because by the end you'll be so drowsy, you'll barely remember where the fire pit was. Picture it. You trudge across damp ground in the Northlands, the wind rattling wooden shingles, and you duck through a heavy wooden door into a smoky room. The smell is thick like a campfire that never quite goes out. Already your eyes water, but the first thing you notice isn't the smoke. It's the warmth wrapping around you like a wool cloak. The longhouse isn't grand. It's long, narrow, and just high enough to feel the smoke gather above you. Archaeologists measure them from 20 to 70 feet depending on the family's status. To your modern eyes, it looks a bit like someone stretched a barn sideways and decided, yes, let's live in here with all the cousins' grandma and about 12 goats. In fairness, the goats are surprisingly warm roommates. One mainstream fact, these houses really were the Viking family home. Families slept cooked, stored food, and told stories in the same shared space. The central hearth, a strip of open fire running lengthwise, gave heat and light. But here's a quirky detail: they rarely built chimneys. Smoke simply floated upwards, seeping through the thatch. So you lie down, and your nose is just at the perfect height to catch the smoky layer. Think of it as a very early version of aromatherapy, except instead of lavender, it's odor-shard wood and singed goat hair. Historians still argue whether this setup was intentional insulation, or just a hazard they learned to live with. Some claim the smoke layer kept insects out and slowed rot in the timber. Others argue it was just bad design. Either way, you're going to cough for the first 15 minutes of bedtime. On the bright side, if you make it through, your lungs are basically pre-smoked like Viking bacon. Now as you step toward the sleeping area, the wind outside rattles against the plank walls. The sound is oddly soothing, like being inside a giant wooden drum. You imagine winter storms howling, snow piling against the door, but in here cramped. Yes, you feel the heat radiating from the fire and even from the bodies. You shuffle past the goats who eye you suspiciously, and you reach the straw bedding laid against the wall. The floor creaks under you, reeds crackle, and you can almost trick yourself into thinking it's comfortable. There's a quiet humour in realising that for Vikings, privacy meant maybe a thin curtain of fabric. You snore, everyone knows. You talk in your sleep. Congratulations, that's public entertainment now. Your only chance at escape is to pull a pelt over your head and pretend you're part of the livestock, and even then someone will probably sit on you by accident. Still, that first moment of lying down, hearing the faint crack of firewood, and the muffled bleat of a goat settling down for the night feels strangely safe. You're in the company of family neighbours and animals all stacked together in one wooden capsule against the dark cold. The outside world is frozen, but inside the air is thick with shared breath warmth, and the faint sound of someone telling half a saga before drifting off. But before you can close your eyes, you realise there's one more ritual everyone must do before sleep, and it's not the one you'd expect. You shuffle deeper into the longhouse, blinking against the haze, and now it's time to tackle the question of what you're actually sleeping on. Spoiler alert, it's not a memory foam mattress. What you find instead is a bed of straw, or rather a rough sack stuffed with rushes, essentially the medieval version of a futon, if futons could give you splinters. When you flop down, the reeds crackle under your weight, a kind of natural ASMR, though after 10 minutes you're itching in places you didn't know could itch. This was the reality: bedding was made of hay straw or reeds, and it needed to be replaced regularly, or it would begin to rot and smell worse than the goat corner. The mainstream historical fact here is that mattresses were actually considered valuable property, sometimes mentioned in wills. Imagine writing, "To my son I leave the farm," and also the slightly less scratchy hay sack. Not exactly a glamorous inheritance, but practical. A quirky tidbit: families often mixed in herbs like juniper or mint with the straw. Not just to smell nicer, but also to discourage fleas and lice. So yes, your mattress is also your air freshener and bug repellent. Very multifunctional, very Viking IKEA. The scholars argue about how effective it actually was. Did juniper really deter pests, or was it more like putting a nice candle next to a dumpster? Some modern tests say the herbs may have helped, but others think the Vikings were just nose-blind to the constant presence of tiny itchy roommates. You roll over on the straw and listen to the rustle, hearing the sound of wind still clawing at the thatch above. The motif for tonight. The wind becomes your lullaby, moaning through cracks, carrying the scent of sea salt and pine from the fjords. It's steady, constant, and in your half-sleeping state you start to imagine the roof beams are creaking in rhythm like the rocking of a ship. Maybe this is how Viking kids trained for voyages, sleeping to the music of storm and timber. Of course, let's not romanticize too much. Straw bedding had its issues. It compacted quickly, meaning you ended up with a lumpy ridge pressing into your back. And if the family forgot to replace it in time, you weren't so much resting as composting. Historians are still debating how often Viking households refreshed their bedding. Was it seasonal? Was it weekly? Or did they just wait until the smell staged a mutiny? We'll probably never know, though a few archaeological finds of bedding suggest at least some effort was made to keep it tidy. Now as you lie there, maybe you laugh softly at the thought of complaining about your modern mattress firmness. You picture a Viking farmer grinning at your orthopedic bed. Oh, your back hurts. Try sleeping on spiky grass and goat fumes. It's humbling but also oddly soothing to think they endured it and still managed to conquer half of Europe. The fire pops, the wind sighs, and you tuck yourself under a pelt trying to forget that the straw underneath you is alive with who knows what. But of course, bedtime in the Longhouse wasn't just about where you lay. The next layer, the sheep pelts, added another level of warmth and also another layer of quirks. You pull the rough woolen pelt over your body and suddenly the Longhouse transforms from drafty barn to something closer to cosy. Well, cosy if you ignore the scratchiness. Sheep pelts were the Viking family's winter insulation, the difference between shivering all night and waking up with enough warmth left in your bones to milk the goats in the morning. It's not luxury bedding, but it does the job. You sink into it and instantly the smell hits you, lanolin smoke and a faint dampness that never quite dries. Congratulations, you now smell exactly like the rest of the household. The mainstream fact sheep pelts were everywhere in Viking life. They weren't just for sleeping. People wore wool tunics, cloaks and layered socks, and they draped pelts over benches and beds to keep the chill out. Archaeological digs in Scandinavia turn up heaps of wool fragments proving just how central this material was. Vikings weren't in fur coats for fashion, they were in them because without wool they'd have frozen solid by mid-November. Now here's the quirky twist, not all pelts were equal. Families had favourites, the good furs reserved for special guests or chieftains. Imagine walking into the Longhouse, and everyone subtly pointing you toward the scratchy one with a hole in it. It's the medieval version of giving your buddy the lumpy couch cushion, and some pelts, especially from darker sheep, were believed to carry protective powers, superstition layered onto insulation. Lay under the right pelt and maybe you'd wake up warmer and luckier. But here's where historians can't quite agree. Did Vikings actually sleep directly under those heavy pelts as blankets? Or were they spread as bedding beneath straw mats with lighter woven covers above? Some reconstructions suggest both. In some cases, you'd have pelts beneath you to block the damp rising from the floor, with wool blankets above you to trap the heat. So your body was effectively sandwiched in sheep. If you've ever had a particularly clingy cat, you already understand the concept. As you lie back, the sensory motif shifts. The fire crackles lower now, but the sound of the pelt rustling around you becomes its own rhythm, soft muffled almost like waves washing a shoreline. You picture yourself at sea, rocking on wool instead of water, and maybe you start to understand how Viking families found comfort here. The smell, the heat, the weight of the pelt, it pressed them into sleep like a heavy quilt you can't quite escape. Modern aside, imagine explaining weighted blankets to a Viking. Yes, it helps with anxiety. They'd nod and say, "Ah, you mean a wet sheepskin. We've been doing that for centuries." You chuckle, but maybe they had a point. Still, no matter how many pelts you pile up, the cold northern air sneaks through. The wind groans against the walls, snow sifts down through the thatch, and you realise warmth only lasts as long as the fire. And fires inconveniently don't tend themselves. Someone has to stir the embers, pile the logs, and make sure the Longhouse doesn't go dark. And wouldn't you know it that duty might fall to you tonight? The glow of the fire dips lower, and you notice how the shadows crawl across the Longhouse beams like sluggish animals. The warmth that only moments ago wrapped you like a heavy cloak begins to thin, replaced by that creeping edge of cold that finds your toes first and then slowly works its way up. You sigh, half asleep, but then you hear someone stirring. It's the ritual of the hearth, the nighttime duty of coaxing embers back into life. In Viking homes, the hearth wasn't just a fireplace. It was the literal axis of life. Without it, you didn't just get cold, you lost your cooking, your light and your comfort. Families arranged everything around this central strip of flame benches on either side, storage tucked away behind, and bedding just within reach of its glow. A mainstream fact here, archaeologists almost always find the remains of hearths in Longhouse digs, often lined with stones or clay to keep the fire from spreading. It's like the house's signature, the one feature you can't mistake. Now for the quirky detail, Vikings didn't only use wood. They burned peat-dried dung, even driftwood washed up on the shores. Imagine crawling out of your straw bed, coughing through the smoke, and tossing a dried cow pie onto the fire. Not glamorous, but fuel was fuel. And here's the kicker, some of these fuels smoked less and may even have helped keep the roof timbers preserved. So yes, you can thank cows for not just milk, but also for keeping your rafters standing. But historians still debate how safe it really was. Without chimneys, the room filled with haze every night. Was this an intentional design to conserve heat? Or did the Vikings simply accept that smoky lungs were the price of staying alive? Some scholars argue the smoke was actually beneficial, curing meats and protecting thatch from insects. Others roll their eyes and mutter something about massive respiratory problems. The truth probably lies somewhere between uncomfortable but necessary. The sensory motif tonight becomes firelight itself. You imagine the faint crackle, a spark leaping like a tiny firefly, then fading into the ash. The warmth on your face contrasts with the cold seeping in at your back. You half hear the wind outside, it's slowed now, no longer shrieking, just brushing the walls with a kind of weary sigh. The house feels suspended in time, a floating island of ember glow against an endless night. There's also a bit of gentle humour in the nightly fire routine. Think of it like the medieval version of arguing over the thermostat. One person swears it's too hot, another shivers dramatically, someone else groans about wasting fuel. Only instead of nudging a dial, you're poking at glowing logs with a stick while trying not to catch your hair on fire. Congratulations, you are now the night shift of the Viking HVAC system. And so you rake the embers, add a new log, and watch the flames build back into life. The glow spreads, the longhouse warms again, and everyone mumbles half asleep thanks as they roll back under their pelts. You lie back, soot smudged on your hands, but with a small sense of pride, you've kept the house alive for another stretch of the night. Still, as you settle down again, you notice something odd along the walls, dark stains, sticky and sharp smelling. The Vikings had another trick for keeping the longhouse sealed, and it wasn't exactly pleasant. You stretch out again, and this time your eyes drift toward the longhouse walls. At first you think it's just soot from the hearth, but then you catch a sharper resinous scent, pine tar. The surfaces are dark, sticky in patches, and glint faintly where the firelight catches them. Tar was the Vikings' all-purpose fixative sealer and weatherproofing, and here you are practically sleeping up against it. The mainstream historical fact is simple. Viking longhouses were smeared with tar to keep out the cold and the wet. The north was damp, storm-lashed, and perpetually flirting with rot. Tar derived from slowly burning pine roots in low-oxygen pits created a waterproof coat that preserved wood against the elements. Whole shipyards relied on the stuff, but so did ordinary homes. It was the medieval equivalent of caulk varnish and duct tape rolled into one sticky miracle. The quirky tidbit is how pungent it was. Tar doesn't politely fade into the background, it grabs your nose and refuses to let go. Imagine trying to drift off to sleep while inhaling something that smells halfway between burnt sugar and an asphalt driveway. And yet the Vikings were so accustomed to it that some scholars think the smell itself became a signal of safety. Tar meant the roof wouldn't leak, the walls wouldn't warp, and the winter storms would stay politely outside. Historians still argue over just how extensively tar was used inside versus only on the exterior. Some evidence suggests beams and walls were thoroughly smeared, which means families lived every day steeped in that aroma. Others believe tar was mostly reserved for exteriors and ships with only minimal interior use. Excavations show residues, but not enough to settle the debate fully. It remains one of those questions where experts nod sagely and then shrug. The sensory motif shifts here from fire to smell. The tar blends with smoke, with wool, with damp straw. It's heavy, almost syrupy, and you can feel it coating the back of your throat. Oddly, it begins to seem comforting. Like the way some people associate mothballs with their grandparents' homes, tar became the scent of continuity. Every Viking child grew up with it in their nose, every elder fell asleep to it, and for them it likely smelled like home. Modern aside, you may think your candle collection is impressive with notes of cedarwood vanilla or ocean breeze. Vikings would laugh and offer you a nice new fragrance ode a ship hull. To be fair, it probably would have sold in certain niche markets. You run your hand along the wall and it comes away tacky, glistening faintly in the firelight. It's not elegant, but it's protection. And protection mattered when winter storms battered the walls, when rain clawed at the thatch, when frost crept into the timbers. You curl back up on your straw and pelt, letting the tar-scented air sink into you. But even as you begin to relax, you notice something dripping from the roof, beams above cold moisture trickling down. And that inconveniently was another part of Viking sleep life. You lie there half dozing when plink. A cold drop lands on your forehead. You jolt a little, brush it away, and a second one follows, sliding off the timber beams above. Welcome to the longhouse drip, the midnight shower nobody asked for. The mainstream fact is that condensation was inevitable in Viking homes. You've got dozens of warm bodies, humans, goats, sheep, maybe even a cow, breathing, sweating, exhaling into a sealed wooden box. Add a fire burning almost constantly, and you've created a perfect humidity factory. The thatched roof absorbs it during the day, then slowly releases the moisture back at night. So instead of peaceful dreams, you get plink, plink, plink right between the eyes. Quirky tidbit. Some households actually spread cloths or animal skins beneath the beams to catch the drips. In effect, they built an early drip tray. Imagine sleeping under what's basically a tarp tent inside your house, listening to the steady drip of condensation like a very budget version of a white noise machine. It's oddly soothing unless the drip is right above your nose. Then it's just personal. And here comes the scholarly debate: how bad was it really? Some reconstructions of longhouses show quite effective thatching layered thick enough to keep moisture out. Others argue that with the climate being as wet as it was, some degree of drip was unavoidable. Archaeologists studying post holes and roof remnants sometimes disagree on how steep or layered the roofs were, which changes how much water would have seeped in. So we're left with this question: was the Viking longhouse a cosy shelter, or a glorified sponge? The sensory motif here shifts to water. You listen to it in your imagination, slow drips tapping into straw-damp straw, squishing faintly as people roll over the faint hiss when a drop hits a live ember in the hearth. Combined with the sighing wind outside, it becomes its own rhythm, a watery lullaby that makes you drowsy even as your toes get damp. Modern aside, you think your leaky apartment ceiling is a problem. Try writing to your Viking landlord. "Dear Olaf, water is dripping on my bedding again. Please send tar and goats immediately." Not much chance of a repair ticket there. Still, you adapt. You shift your bedding away from the worst leak curl tighter into your pelt and let the damp air settle around you. Everyone else does the same. The longhouse breathes with you, sighs with you, and yes, occasionally spits on you. But as you drift back towards sleep, you realize you're not alone. A shuffle, a soft bleat, the unmistakable sound of hooves against straw. Because in the Viking night, the family didn't just share the house with people. You pull the pelt closer, grateful for its scratchy warmth, and then there it is, a snort. Not from Uncle Bjorn, from something with 4 legs and questionable table manners. Welcome to the other part of Viking family life, the livestock. One solid historical fact is that longhouses weren't just homes for humans, they were barns too. Archaeological digs in Scandinavia often reveal one end of the structure reserved for animals. Sheep, goats, pigs, sometimes cows sharing walls heat, and occasionally, let's be honest, the same fleas. To a Viking farmer, this wasn't strange. Animals were wealth. If you owned a cow, you didn't just own milk, you owned survival. You weren't about to leave it shivering in the cold while you hogged the fire, so yes, the cow came inside too. The quirky tidbit here is how deliberate the setup was. Some longhouses even had raised partitions, low wooden planks dividing the people, side from the cow side. Picture it, you lying in bed and 2 feet away a goat gives you side-eye chewing in that eternal goat way, probably plotting something. Children grew up hearing not just lullabies, but also the bleating chorus of their extended barnyard family. In a way, it was nature's white noise machine. You may have your rain sounds playlist, but Vikings had cow shuffle and goat sneeze in surround sound. But scholars still debate how much of this mingling was nightly reality versus seasonal necessity. Some evidence suggests animals were kept in only during the harshest winters, while in milder seasons they were penned outside. Others argue that longhouses were essentially half barn all year long. The arguments rest on soil analysis, animal bone remains, and post-hole patterns, archaeology at its muddiest. No one can agree exactly how many hooves shared the room on any given night. As you lie there now, the sensory motif shifts to sound. You hear the low sigh of wind outside, yes, but layered over it the shuffle of hooves, the rustle of straw, the occasional cough, and you're not sure if it's from a human or a goat. There's warmth in that sound, though. Each animal body adds heat, turning the longhouse into a giant biological furnace. You might wrinkle your nose at the smell, but when your breath fogs in the winter night, you won't complain. Modern aside, imagine telling your landlord you're bringing in a cow as a space heater. It's for sustainability, you'd argue. Vikings, of course, would nod approvingly and hand you a pitchfork. So you shift again in your straw, listening to the duet of goat and wind, half annoyed, half comforted. You realize that for a Viking child, those sounds meant safety. It meant the family herd was close, it meant food and milk tomorrow, it meant another night survived together. But just as you start to drift off, there's another sound, softer, gentler, something entirely human. A low song, a lullaby in a language you don't yet understand. The bleat of a goat fades into the background, and in its place you hear something far softer a voice. A woman's most likely low steady, carrying just enough tone to cut through the crackle of the fire and the restless shifting of straw. It's a lullaby, one of those old Norse cradle songs that rarely made it into sagas but lived on in families whispered at bedtime. The mainstream fact is that Vikings sang to their children at night. Evidence comes less from sagas, which were too busy recounting battles and feuds, and more from scattered verses, folk survivals, and later Icelandic traditions. Some of these lullabies warned of trolls or elves, others were simple soothing rhymes meant to settle little ones after a day of chores. Imagine lying in the longhouse, half the family piled together under wool, and a soft refrain drifting through smoke and bleats. For a child, this was safety wrapped in sound. The quirky detail, some lullabies doubled as do your chores songs. Little verses reminded children to fetch water, to mind the goats, to leave wood by the fire. Falling asleep meant absorbing the family's to-do list by osmosis. In a sense, Viking kids went to bed with lullabies that sounded like "Sleep, little one." But don't forget tomorrow's kindling. Practical if not the coziest sentiment. And here's where scholars debate, were these lullabies uniquely Norse, or were they borrowed and blended from wider Germanic traditions? The melodies themselves are lost, but fragments of lyrics survive. Some researchers argue for continuity, that these were deeply local songs flavoured with Norse mythology. Others suggest the melodies drifted across trade routes, shifting like languages. Did Viking children fall asleep to something their Frisian cousins also heard? We'll never fully know. The sensory motif now shifts to sound more intimately. You can almost hear the lullaby's cadence slow as waves lapping on the shore. The voice rises, dips, then lingers on a single note carrying warmth through the smoky air. For you lying there in the straw, it's less about the words and more about the rhythm. Your breathing starts to sync to it, like your body recognizing a bedtime command passed down through centuries. There's humour here too. You think of your own lullabies, Twinkle Twinkle Little Star maybe. Then compare it to the Viking version. Don't let the trolls carry you off. Comforting in its own way, though maybe not what a nervous child wants to imagine at midnight. Still, Viking parents knew that the fear of the dark was real, so they wrapped the unknown in rhyme, softened it into song. As the lullaby fades, you feel the weight of the day leave your shoulders. The wind outside taps gently on the walls like a slow drum beat. You shift once more under your pelt eyes, half closing, lulled by the memory of words you don't even need to understand. But just when you think sleep will take you, someone across the room coughs, stirs, and climbs up onto one of the long benches. Because in the Viking night, not everyone slept on straw. You roll over and hear the scrape of wood, someone climbing onto a bench instead of curling up on the straw floor. Your eyes follow the shape through the haze, and suddenly you remember not every Viking slept at ground level. Those long benches lining the hearth weren't just for sitting. They doubled as beds, offering the closest thing to a deluxe option inside the smoky barnhouse. The mainstream fact benches were the prize sleeping spots. They were raised keeping you off the cold dirt floor, and they could be padded with straw furs or woven blankets. Archaeological reconstructions often show built-in platforms along the walls, sturdy enough for an adult to stretch out, maybe even wide enough for two if they didn't mind elbows. To modern eyes it looks Spartan planks and straw, but in Viking terms this was an upgrade. Now for the quirky detail, benches often had storage underneath. So when you lay down at night you weren't just resting, you were also essentially sleeping on top of tomorrow's supplies. Spare tools, dried fish, maybe even a bundle of onions. It's a strange sort of comfort, like a medieval Costco bed. You fall asleep knowing your food and gear are literally right under you, safe from damp and nibbling rodents. And here comes the scholarly debate, were benches reserved for elders' guests or higher-ranking family members, or were they just first come, first serve? Some evidence from sagas suggests social hierarchy extended even into sleep chieftains, and honoured visitors claim the best spots while lower status folks took to the floor. Others argue benches were simply practical and used by whoever got there first. It's one of those areas where archaeology gives us the furniture but not the rules. The sensory motif here becomes texture. Imagine your back against solid timber, the grain rough under thin bedding. You shift and hear the creak of wood, the faint smell of stored onions drifting up the warmth of the fire spilling over your face, while your feet still feel the draft. The plank is harder than straw, but blessedly dry, and in a world of constant damp that counts for everything. Modern aside, you might grumble about your fold-out couch when guests visit. A Viking would look at that and say, "Luxury! You have springs and cushions, we had carrots and goats under our beds." As you watch the figure settle on the bench, pulling a cloak tight, you can't help but feel a flicker of envy. Elevated, warm, less likely to wake with a wet drip on your forehead, that's the dream. But of course, even benches had their problems. With so many bodies crammed together, privacy was a laughable idea. Which is why, as your eyes adjust to the firelight, you notice something else. A curtain swaying gently meant to hide. Well, not much. You blink through the haze and notice a thin strip of cloth fluttering faintly near one of the benches. At first it looks like just another hanging garment, maybe a cloak drying from yesterday's storm. But no, this little curtain has a purpose. It is the Viking version of a private bedroom door, which is to say it doesn't work very well. The mainstream fact some longhouse benches were equipped with draped fabric animal hides or wooden partitions to give sleepers a semblance of privacy. Archaeologists and historians often call them bed boxes or alcove beds. Think of them as cubbies along the wall enclosed on three sides and sometimes closed off with a curtain. For the person lucky enough to sleep there, it meant less draught, less drip, and at least the illusion of personal space. Now, the quirky tidbit, these curtains weren't just about modesty. They were insulation. The heavy wool or linen fabric trapped warmth in a tiny pocket like a personal microclimate. Curl up inside and suddenly you didn't need quite so many layers. Of course, the trade-off was that you also trapped every bit of your own breath smell and snoring. Cozy, yes. Fresh, no. Imagine your partner saying, "Honey, let's go to bed in our shared hay box." Romantic in its own pungent way. Historians still debate how common these bed spaces really were. Some reconstructions show nearly every bench lined with them, suggesting entire families could retreat into curtained compartments. Others think they were rare, reserved for the wealthy, or the head of the household. Written sources like the Icelandic sagas sometimes describe beds in the wall, but whether those were widespread or exceptional is up for grabs. So even here we're left peeking through a curtain of uncertainty. The sensory motif tonight shifts to touch. Picture yourself sliding into one of these alcoves, pulling the heavy fabric across. Immediately the world narrows. You feel the coarse weave under your fingers, stiff from smoke and years of use. The air is warmer but thicker, filled with the smell of wool and wood smoke. Outside you can still hear the faint bleat of a goat and the whisper of the wind, but inside it feels muffled, like wrapping your entire world in a blanket. There's some humour here too. If you've ever shared a dorm room or a noisy apartment, you know the desperate measures people take to carve out privacy. Headphones, makeshift walls, piling up pillows. Vikings did the same thing, except their headphones were strips of cloth and their room dividers were goat hides. Same instinct, just fewer IKEA options. You imagine closing your eyes inside that alcove, the firelight, just a faint glow filtering through the curtain's edges. For a moment you almost believe you're alone. Almost. But then snore. Loud, guttural, vibrating through the wood beam. Privacy in a Viking longhouse, it turns out, was mostly a polite fiction. And yet even with the snores, the smells and the creaking benches, there was still a bedtime rhythm everyone followed. Before true sleep came, there were duties to finish tending embers, checking animals, preparing for dawn. And sometimes those final chores were stranger than you'd expect. You're finally tucked in, pelt pulled up curtain, drawn eyes half closed. Just as you're drifting, you hear a shuffle, someone is up. The night in a Viking longhouse was never completely still. Before everyone could surrender to the dark, there were chores, those last small tasks that stitched the family's survival together. The mainstream fact fires had to be managed, animals checked, tools stacked, shoes dried. Shoes especially were important. Soaked leather left unattended would freeze and crack. So imagine half asleep dragging yourself from the straw, stretching stiff legs and hanging your boots by the hearth to steam gently in the smoke. Children might be nudged awake to carry a last basket of kindling inside. Even the goats had to be glanced at, because one escaped hoofprint in the morning snow could mean chasing livestock through freezing darkness. The quirky detail is that some families believed in night ward's protective charms placed before bed. A piece of iron tucked near the door, a carved rune slipped under a pillow, or even something as simple as sprinkling salt near the hearth. These weren't just chores, but rituals, a way of telling the unseen world, "All right, we're going to sleep now. Please leave us alone until dawn." Picture a Viking farmer muttering a half-hearted charm, then stumbling into bed with hay in his hair. And the scholars. They still argue about whether these nighttime routines were structured rituals or just common sense passed down as habit. Some sagas hint at nightly blessings, others barely mention them, focusing instead on morning duties. Archaeology doesn't help much except for the odd discovery of charms buried near doorways. Were those everyday protections or special occasions? The debate lingers like an ember never quite going out. The sensory motif in this section shifts to movement. You feel it, the soft scrape of wood against stone as embers are raked, the rustle of wool skirts as someone checks a storage basket, the steady thump of boots on timber floorboards. Layered under it all is the hush of the wind outside brushing against the longhouse walls, impatient but unable to get in. It's like the building itself is breathing with you, exhaling through every chore completed. A little humour sneaks in here too. Imagine calling these chores the night shift, everyone already tired, fumbling in the dim glow, tripping over a goat who stubbornly refuses to budge. It's basically the Viking version of locking up the house before bed, except instead of checking if the oven is off, you're checking that the cow hasn't leaned too close to the fire. When at last the chores are done, the embers glow steady, the animals quiet, and the family sighs into their bedding once more. But winter nights in the north are long, and survival means pooling more than just chores. It means pooling warmth, human warmth. Which is why as the wind rises again, everyone shifts closer together beneath the firs. You've made it through the nightly chores, but the fire is fickle and the walls are thin. The cold presses in again, and this is when Viking families turn to their most reliable insulation, each other. You shift under your pelt, and like dominoes, everyone edges closer, a slow migration of bodies toward the hearth. By the time you've found your spot, you're part of a giant human patchwork quilt. The mainstream fact is simple: shared sleeping was the norm. In longhouses, whole families, parents, children, grandparents slept side by side, sometimes overlapping, sometimes stacked too deep. Add in servants or thralls, and the picture gets even more crowded. This wasn't just cultural, it was practical. Human bodies generate heat, and pressed together under layers of wool you became your own heating system. Today, you call it body heat. Back then, it was called not freezing to death. The quirky detail Vikings sometimes included their dogs in the pile. Archaeological remains suggest that dogs weren't only working animals, but companions who shared the hearth and bedding. Imagine a big, shaggy hound pressed against your feet, tail twitching in sleep while your cousin snores in your ear. It's less a peaceful slumber, and more like being assigned to the world's strangest bunk bed. Historians still debate the social rules of this setup. Was there a fixed order elders near the fire, children at the edges? Or did people simply collapse wherever they found space? Some sagas hint at hierarchy with the most important figures claiming prime spots. Others suggest a more fluid arrangement guided by comfort and convenience. Either way, it was less about personal preference and more about group survival. Your bedmate wasn't always chosen, it was whoever's body could keep you warm. The sensory motif shifts here to warmth itself. You feel it, the radiating press of another shoulder against yours, the collective weight of pelts rising and falling, with synchronized breaths, the gentle heat pooling beneath layers of wool. Outside, the wind claws harder at the walls, but inside you're cocooned in human heat. The longhouse has become less a building and more a shared body. There's humour in this too. You think of modern couples bickering about stealing the covers. Now picture 10 people, 2 goats and a dog, all trying to share the same pile of blankets. A Viking would shrug at your complaints. Covers? You mean those furs everyone's drooling on? Share them or freeze. You close your eyes, breathing in the mingled smell of wool smoke and humanity. For a moment it feels almost secure, like the world outside doesn't matter. Yet even here, pressed close in the heart of the family, comfort is fragile. The air grows still, the fire burns low, and dreams begin to stir, dreams that were as important to Vikings as the waking day. Your breathing slows, and as the warmth of the family pile seeps into your bones, your mind drifts into that hazy territory between waking and sleep. For Vikings, dreams weren't just idle images. They were powerful, sometimes prophetic, sometimes unsettling, and often retold the next day like news from another world. You don't just dream here, you step into a different kind of saga. The mainstream fact sagas and Eddas frequently mention dreams as omens. A farmer might wake and declare he'd seen a raven in the night sky, a symbol of Odin. A mother might dream of weaving cloth that unravelled, warning of illness or loss. Dreams could guide decisions from whether to travel that day to whether to marry a particular suitor. Sleep wasn't downtime, it was a channel. You lying on your straw and pelt might find your subconscious enlisted as a family advisor before breakfast. Here's the quirky tidbit: some Viking families told bedtime stories not just to entertain, but to shape dreams. Elders would recite sagas by the fire, weaving images of heroes, voyages, and gods. The idea was that these tales might slip into the dreams of listeners, offering strength or courage. Imagine drifting off after hearing of Thor's hammer striking giants, then dreaming your own hammer against some monstrous foe. A medieval version of lucid dreaming courtesy of Uncle Bjorn's storytelling. And here's where scholars still argue, were these dream beliefs truly universal or exaggerated by later storytellers. Some academics claim sagas emphasize dreams to make narratives more dramatic, not because everyone believed them. Others point to runic inscriptions and folk survivals as proof that dream reading was woven into daily life. Did every Viking really wake up and hold a family press conference about their dreams? Or was it just the notable ones, the dreams too vivid to ignore? We may never know, but the sagas hint at both. The sensory motif here drifts towards sound and silence. You hear the fire whispering low and ember collapsing into ash. Outside, the wind has quieted, leaving only the faint lap of distant water waves against a fjord perhaps. Inside, the breathing of the family slows into a rhythm, each inhale and exhale a tide pulling you deeper into your own dream sea. Modern aside, you might laugh because you have dream journals and sleep apps telling you about REM cycles. Vikings. Their sleep tracker was Aunt Solveig leaning over porridge saying, "Your dream about the wolf last night means don't go fishing today." Simple, if not exactly scientific. As you sink into that dream state yourself, you realize that sagas, songs, and snores all blend together here, creating a kind of shared imagination. But the Longhouse night wasn't only about dreams. It was also about survival, and survival meant knowing that at any moment the fire could falter again. You stir in your sleep, the wool rough against your cheek, and for a moment you wonder if the crackle you hear is still part of your dream. But no, it's the hearth again, whispering low, almost defeated. The glow has thinned to faint embers, each one pulsing like the last heartbeat of the fire. If the family wants to wake up warm, someone has to get up. Again. The mainstream fact: Viking families kept their hearth alive around the clock. Letting it go out meant the burden of relighting from scratch, often by striking flint on iron, a process that wasn't impossible, but in the dark cold of night, it was misery. So families built a rhythm, raking embers, feeding just enough wood, and sometimes banking the fire with ash to keep it smouldering longer. A fire wasn't just heat, it was continuity, like a flame passed from one day to the next. The quirky detail: some households used a slow-burning log nicknamed a sleeping stick. It smouldered all night, radiating enough heat to prevent complete darkness. Think of it as the Viking version of a nightlight, except it was a chunk of wood glowing gently while the goats grumbled beside it. Children may have fallen asleep comforted by that steady orange shimmer, as familiar as your bedside lamp. Here's where historians still argue: how safe was this really? With no chimney, with smoke already thick, how did families avoid suffocating or burning the place down? Some argue the design of the roof allowed enough ventilation for survival. Others think smoke levels must have been unhealthy and shortened lifespans. The truth likely falls in between uncomfortable, smoky, but workable, like living in a perpetual barbecue pit. The sensory motif now becomes the fire's breath. You feel the faint heat on your face, the soft hiss, as a log shifts the ghostly trails of smoke weaving upward through the rafters. It's fragile, almost apologetic, but still alive. Outside, the wind has picked up again, rattling the door as if testing the house. Inside that ember glow is your shield, a fragile heartbeat standing between family warmth and the deep cold waiting to creep in. Humour helps here. You imagine the Viking version of today's thermostat argument. One family member insists, "We don't need more wood, it's fine," while another sneaks out of bed to toss on a log anyway. The goats, of course, are Switzerland content as long as someone occasionally drops them straw, so the embers live on. A parent rolls over, rakes them with a stick and adds a small log. You watch the sparks leap tiny stars in the smoky dark before they fade, and you think maybe this is what comfort meant: not total warmth, not perfect air, but just enough light and heat to carry you to morning. Yet as the fire steadies, another presence lingers in the Longhouse night. Not human, not animal, but woven into the rhythm of bedtime itself. Protective charms and quiet rituals meant to guard against things you couldn't see. You're just about to let the fire's steady glow lull you back into that blissful drift when you notice something glinting by the doorway. Not gold, not jewellery, just a little iron nail hammered into the timber frame oddly out of place. And tucked beneath it a scrap of carved wood worn smooth from years of touch. It's a reminder that Vikings didn't leave their sleep to chance. They protected the night with charms. The mainstream fact, superstition and ritual were woven into daily life. Archaeological digs turn up small iron knives buried near thresholds, bits of amber bones and runes carved on sticks. These weren't lost trinkets, they were warding charms. In a world where drafty walls and smoky air weren't the only nightly threat, people placed these tokens as silent guardians. Spirits, trolls, elves, they all had to be kept at bay if you wanted a full night's rest. The quirky tidbit. Some families even tucked protective objects under their bedding. Imagine rolling over and bumping into a little carved Thor's hammer under your straw mattress. A Viking version of a dream catcher. Except instead of filtering nightmares, it probably just poked you in the ribs at 2 a.m. Still, belief mattered. If the charm was there, the mind could rest. Scholars still debate how seriously Vikings treated these rituals. Were they daily necessities for everyone or occasional practices for the deeply devout? Some argue that the sagas exaggerate the role of charms, folding them into grand stories for dramatic effect. Others counter that the sheer number of talismans found in household excavations proves they were common everyday defences. The truth, as always, probably rests in the smoky middle ground. Charms were not universal, but they were far from rare. The sensory motif shifts here to silence. You hear it between the coughs between the bleats of goats, a hush that feels thicker than smoke as though the longhouse itself is listening. The only sound is the faint jangle of an iron nail against timber when the wind rattles the walls, and somehow that sound feels protective, like a bell reminding you all is watched, all is safe. Modern aside, think of how many people today can't sleep without a lucky object nearby: stuffed animals, photos, nightlights. Vikings weren't so different. They just happened to favour rusty bits of iron and carved runes instead of teddy bears. So you settle deeper under the pelts, reassured by charms you can't quite see. The fire hums low, the walls creak, and you feel wrapped not just in wool but in a web of invisible protections. But not everyone needed charms. Some Vikings slept easier not with talismans, but with status. Their beds were bigger, higher, and far more comfortable. Which leads us to the question of how the chieftains slumbered. You shuffle in your bedding, listening to the goats sigh and the fire hiss, and your mind wanders. What if you weren't lying here on the straw or the benches at all? What if you were the chieftain? The rules of Viking bedtime shift noticeably when you hold authority. The mainstream fact, chieftains and wealthier farmers often had their own raised beds, sometimes even enclosed wooden bed boxes. These were sturdier, larger constructions, almost like small closets tucked along the longhouse wall. Some had carved panels, decorative frames, and more layers of furs. A step up from the straw and benches, they offered the closest thing to a master bedroom, though still inside the same smoky, crowded space. The quirky detail is that these bed boxes weren't only for sleep, they doubled as status symbols. Guests would notice them immediately, the carving speaking loudly about wealth and craftsmanship. Imagine walking into a longhouse, and your eye going straight to the ornate bed, the Viking equivalent of a four-poster canopy bed from IKEA's Jarl collection. And sometimes sagas even describe these beds being used as social stages, chieftains receiving visitors, while reclining much like Roman nobles lounging on couches. Sleep but make it political. Here's where historians debate how common were these fancy beds. Some believe they were rare luxuries limited to the most prosperous households. Others suggest they were relatively widespread among the moderately wealthy, though not necessarily carved so ornately. The evidence is fragmentary bits of carved wood sagas mentioning bed closets and reconstructions that may or may not match reality. Scholars still shrug and argue, leaving us to imagine the range from humble plank to miniature palace. The sensory motif now turns to space. You can almost feel what it's like to climb into one of those enclosed beds' wooden panels at your side. The faint scent of resin and wool, mixing the darkness, wrapping tighter as you pull a carved door or curtain closed. The noise of goats and family dulls just slightly giving you the illusion of privacy. Inside it's warmer, quieter, and perhaps just a little smug. There's humour in this scene too. Picture the chieftain snoring proudly in his enclosed bed while the rest of the household piles together under damp pelts. It's the medieval version of executive suite. And of course, even in such luxury, he still breathed the same smoky air and heard the same goats coughing. The gap between rich and poor at night was measured in inches, not mansions. You stretch under your pelt and imagine just for a moment the weight of carved wood above you instead of dripping thatch. A little more comfortable, yes. A little more dignified, perhaps. But ultimately still just another human trying to sleep through a northern winter. And while the chieftains rested in style, the entire household moved to a rhythm beyond individuals, a rhythm dictated by seasons. Nights grew longer, colder, and the way families slept shifted with them. The night stretches on, and you begin to realize something curious. The longhouse doesn't always sleep the same way because the seasons themselves dictate the rhythm. In winter, sleep is heavy and stretched like the dark skies. In summer, it's light and broken, caught in short snatches between chores. The Viking bed was not just a physical space, it was a calendar written into bodies. The mainstream fact Scandinavia's latitude meant extreme differences in daylight. Winters brought endless nights when families might sleep longer, huddled under furs conserving energy. Summers, by contrast, could see near constant daylight, and sleep was interrupted by work festivals and the urgency of farming. The very length of rest changed with the seasons. Modern medicine talks about circadian rhythms. Vikings had whole seasonal rhythms. The quirky tidbit: some sources suggest that winter nights were so long that sleep was often divided. Families might doze early, wake for a spell in the middle of the night, stirring the fire, whispering stories, even sneaking a snack, then drift back down for a second sleep. It sounds unusual, but historians note that this segmented sleep pattern existed in many pre-modern societies. Picture yourself waking at midnight nibbling dried fish by the fire, while goats blink at you in the dark, then rolling back under the pelt pile for round 2. And the scholarly debate was this segmented sleep deliberate or simply a natural response to the environment. Some historians argue that first sleep and second sleep were ingrained cultural habits. Others caution that we're reading too much into a few scattered references. The sagas themselves rarely detail when people slept, focusing more on what they did when awake. So we piece together fragments arguing whether Vikings consciously embraced broken nights or just accepted them without comment. The sensory motif here becomes time itself. You feel the slow tick of night not by a clock but by the shifting of firelight and the sigh of wind at the walls. The first stretch of sleep is deep and heavy, the kind where the straw moulds to your shape. Then you wake briefly, noticing embers glowing like tiny red stars before sliding into another round of dreams. The rhythm is not rigid, it breathes with the world outside, with the length of shadows and the turning of the year. There's humour here as well. Imagine telling a Viking you need 8 hours of uninterrupted rest. They'd laugh, hand you a pelt and say, "Good luck. Wake up when the goat does." To them, sleep was flexible, practical and communal, not a personal wellness routine with lavender sprays and sleep apps. So you drift half in half out time bending with the night. And as the season presses its weight on your eyelids, you realise sleep wasn't just about comfort. It was also about how families organised themselves. Who lay beside whom? Who got the warmer spots? Who ended up near the door when the frost crept in? The sleeping order itself carried meaning. You roll onto your side, shifting against the pelt, and suddenly you notice how carefully everyone seems arranged in their little strip of space. It isn't random who sleeps where in the longhouse follows an order, one that reflects family ties, social rank, and the stubborn need to keep the peace when a dozen people are packed into one smoky barn. The mainstream fact in Viking society sleeping order mattered. The head of the household, often the farmer or chieftain, claimed the prime spot, usually near the hearth, but not so close that sparks singed the blankets. Spouses and children clustered nearby. Servants, thralls, and distant kin were pushed outward toward the draughts and drips near the walls or door. Even bedtime reflected hierarchy. If you ever doubted who mattered most in a household, you only had to check whose toes stayed warm. The quirky tidbit: some sagas describe couples lying together under a shared cover, but others hint at surprisingly pragmatic arrangements. For example, if a mother had a newborn, she might sleep flanked by siblings or relatives for extra warmth and help. Teenagers could be tucked near animals. Imagine sulky Viking adolescents, grumbling about being stuck next to the goat pen, the medieval version of "why do I always get the couch?" Sleeping space wasn't just physical, it was political real estate, and the scholarly debate: was this arrangement rigid or flexible? Some historians argue that households had a fixed order, reinforced by tradition and custom. Others suggest it was more fluid. Whoever got to the bench first might keep it, while lower status folks shuffled around depending on guests or weather. Excavations give us walls and post holes, but they don't tell us who slept where. Scholars argue based on sagas, but sagas mix history with storytelling, so the truth remains fuzzy. The sensory motif now shifts to closeness. You feel the press of shoulders, the shared weight of pelts, the slight shuffle as someone rolls over and everyone else adjusts like dominoes. Heat spreads unevenly, the innermost sleepers sweat a little, while the ones near the door curl tighter, bracing against the icy draft sneaking in through the gaps. You can almost sense the longhouse breathing as one organism shifting and sighing in its collective bed. Modern aside, you may complain about sleeping in a crowded hostel or on a family camping trip. A Viking would listen, shrug and say, "Try 30 winters packed in with goats' cousins and in-laws. That's the deluxe package." Privacy wasn't even a concept, it was survival measured in degrees of warmth. So as you settle in your imagined place somewhere in the middle, not too close to the goats, not too far from the hearth, you realise you're part of a nightly choreography. Everyone's position matters not just for comfort, but for the silent rhythm of the household. And yet this rhythm wasn't static. When guests arrived, when festivals called, when strangers were welcomed, the longhouse had to stretch its seams and make space for more. And that was when sleep became an act of hospitality. The pelt itches against your cheek, and just as you're drifting off again, the longhouse door creaks. A gust of icy air slips in, followed by the shuffle of boots. Guests. In the Viking world, visitors didn't just get a seat at the fire, they got a place in the sleep pile. Hospitality wasn't a courtesy, it was a duty. Which meant that when someone arrived, the sleeping chart had to be redrawn on the spot. The mainstream fact hospitality was sacred in Viking culture. The laws of guest right meant that travellers, even strangers, could expect shelter, food and warmth. Refusing a guest could spark feuds or invite shame. So when visitors came late, you didn't argue. You shifted over, pulled your cloak tighter and made room. Archaeological evidence of unusually long benches and sagas describing crowded halls both reinforce this. Longhouses weren't just family homes, they were community shelters when needed. The quirky detail, sometimes the host gave the guest a better spot than his own kin. Imagine being elbowed off your warm bench because Cousin Olaf had to offer hospitality points to a merchant passing through. And yes, there are hints that guests occasionally grumbled about conditions to sagas record witty exchanges about drafty corners or smoky rafters, proof that even in the 10th century complaining about sleeping arrangements was alive and well. And the debate scholars still argue about how comfortable these visitors really were. Some sagas paint a picture of lavish feasts and cosy resting places, while others hint at overcrowding with guests wedged into smoky corners, barely able to stretch. Did the host really offer prime spots, or were guests politely shoved toward the goat pen? It depends on whose saga you read. The truth likely varied by wealth and mood. The sensory motif here shifts to space, or the lack of it. You feel bodies rearranging around you, someone's elbow pressing into your ribs, the shuffle of straw as another mat is dragged closer to the hearth. The fire sputters under the new drafts from the open door, and the chill takes a moment to settle back into warmth. Even the goats stir grumbling as their corner gets a little more crowded. It's tight, uncomfortable, and oddly reassuring. There's humour in the thought too. Today guests get a clean guest room and maybe fresh towels. Vikings got a share of your straw and a warning not to roll into the goat by accident. Make yourself at home took on a very literal, very cramped meaning. So you lie there in the shuffle of new arrivals, listening to unfamiliar snores join the chorus, thinking how elastic a longhouse had to be stretching to include not just family but community. And as the house settles once more into its crowded rhythm, you hear the sounds of the night resume firewind goats. But one sound never really fades, the restless noise of bodies shifting, snoring, coughing. Sleep, it turns out, was never truly silent. You've just begun to doze again when the chorus starts. First a deep rumble from the far bench like a bear clearing its throat, then a sharp whistle from the straw near the hearth. Add in a cough, a sneeze, and somewhere at the back the unmistakable shuffle of hooves. Welcome to the Viking Night Symphony. The mainstream fact longhouses were noisy places even after everyone lay down. With dozens of humans and livestock crammed together, silence was a fantasy. Snoring, coughing babies, fussing dogs, shifting goats, muttering it all blended into a low constant hum. The sagas rarely describe quiet nights. Instead, they focus on gatherings and noise and activity. Archaeological evidence supports it too. Large communal dwellings were never meant for solitude. The quirky tidbit. Some scholars suggest Vikings used sound itself as reassurance. Noise meant life. A silent longhouse could be alarming. Was the fire out? Were the animals gone? Was someone ill? The steady soundtrack of human and animal rest was a sign the household was intact. To modern ears, it's a nuisance. To Viking ears, it was comfort. Historians still debate how much of this noise was tolerated versus actively managed. Did families develop habits to quiet certain disturbances? Were there rules about where the loudest snorers slept? Some sagas slyly mention complaints, but they're vague. The archaeological record, of course, doesn't preserve snores, so scholars are left speculating, and the Viking night remains an orchestra we can only imagine. The sensory motif here is sound layered upon sound. You hear the steady bass of a man's snore, the wheeze of a child's congested breathing, the staccato cough of someone with a smoky throat. Beneath it, all the rhythmic shuffle of animals settling and the occasional pop of the fire. It becomes oddly hypnotic, a background drone that pulls you deeper towards sleep. A modern aside, think of it as the medieval version of white noise. Today you download an app with forest sounds or rainfall. Back then you got goats chewing number 3 and Uncle Bjorn's epic snore. Free though admittedly harder to turn off. Still, as you lie there in the midst of this soundscape, you begin to accept it. Your body relaxes, not in spite of the noise, but because of it. This is what survival sounded like. Life continuing in the dark, everyone present, everyone breathing. And yet you can't ignore the wind outside. Louder now, pressing harder, rattling the door, reminding you that beyond this noisy cocoon, storms are waiting. And when the weather howled, the longhouse had to prove it could hold. The sounds of snores and goats fade for a moment as something stronger takes over the storm. Outside, the wind claws at the longhouse like a restless giant, rattling the plank door, tugging at the thatch. Snow hisses against the roof, icy grains slipping into every seam. You can feel the cold through the wall, sharp as a knife, reminding you that survival here was never guaranteed. The mainstream fact Viking longhouses were built to withstand brutal weather. Thick turf walls, steep thatched roofs, and tar-sealed timbers were all designed to keep wind and snow at bay. Excavations show longhouses often built partially into the earth, using the ground itself as insulation. Still, no matter how carefully crafted, winter storms tested them. Families huddled together, listening to the storm's fury, hoping the structure held. A quirky tidbit: some families actually treated storms as a kind of background entertainment. Sagas mention storytellers using the howling of the wind as dramatic backdrop, turning the storm into a special effect for their tales. Imagine Grandpa spinning a saga about Odin's wrath while the walls groan in real time. Scary, yes, but also oddly theatrical. And the debate historians argue about how draft-proof these homes really were. Some reconstructions suggest they were surprisingly snug, especially with turf insulation. Others insist that gaps in the walls and roofs must have let in significant cold. Written sources often dramatize the harshness, but archaeology hints at homes that were in their own way practical and efficient. The truth may be that comfort depended on constant maintenance and sheer tolerance. The sensory motif here is wind. You feel it vibrating through the planks, hear it whistle past the edges, imagine it tugging at your pelt like invisible fingers. Yet inside you sense the contrast, fire still glowing. Bodies pressed together, the faint warmth pooling against the onslaught. The storm is loud, but it can't quite reach you. Humour drifts in here too. You imagine a Viking version of the weather forecast: tonight snow sleet goats in the kitchen. Tomorrow still snow, and the day after that guess what snow. Vikings didn't check apps. They listened to their walls complain and judged the snow depth by how hard it was to open the door. So you lie there listening as the storm plays its furious music on the outside of the house. The timbers creak, but they hold. The thatch flutters, but it doesn't fail. And though the wind shrieks inside the longhouse, you're surrounded by warmth and breath, a little island of life in a frozen world. But storms weren't the only interruptions in the Viking night. Sometimes, even when the wind faded, someone still had to rise for a midnight duty that couldn't be ignored. The storm eases, the wind sighs, and you think maybe now finally sleep will come without interruption. But then you hear it, a soft creak of wood footsteps on straw. Someone's awake again. Not because the fire needs tending this time, but because one midnight duty in a Viking household was unavoidable, the call of nature. The mainstream fact without latrines inside someone had to step outside into the freezing dark, or in some households use a wooden bucket tucked discreetly near the door. Archaeological finds of waste pits near longhouses confirm that at least part of the time night meant venturing out into the cold. Imagine the courage it took to shuffle out of your warm straw nest, push open the heavy door, and brave the storm just to relieve yourself. The quirky tidbit: Some sagas and later folklore mention charms or whispers, recited before stepping out at night, especially in winter. Not just to fend off trolls or spirits, but maybe to gather courage. Picture muttering a quick prayer while shivering barefoot in the snow, clutching your tunic tight. It's both practical and absurd, the kind of midnight ritual you don't brag about in the morning. Historians still debate how often indoor solutions were used. Was the bucket a common fixture, or reserved for the frail and the sick? Excavations occasionally reveal traces of waste in longhouse corners, suggesting desperate measures during harsh weather. But was that regular practice, or just survival in emergencies? Scholars can't quite agree though. Most lean toward a mix, some nights outside, some nights not. The sensory motif shifts to cold. You feel the air bite your skin as the door creaks open. The warmth you carried out evaporates instantly, replaced by a sharp sting in your lungs. The world outside is dark, muffled under snow, and the silence is vast. Even the goats tucked behind you in the longhouse seem to pause their breathing, as the night stretches endless around you. There's humour in this too. Imagine being the unlucky one nudged to wake your turn. Today we argue about who gets up to check on the baby or the thermostat. Back then you argued about who had to step into a blizzard at 2 a.m. A Viking would smirk and say, "You think your night shift is rough." When the duty is done, you stumble back inside, stamping snow from your boots, your breath fogging the smoky air. The warmth of the fire feels like a miracle all over again, and you curl back into the pelt pile, grateful that for now, the longhouse is steady, sealed, and quiet. But just as you start to drift, a thought lingers how much of this night routine was shared across generations, shaped by stories, rituals, and rhythms. For Vikings, sleep wasn't just survival, it was also a kind of tradition. And the stories they told before drifting off reveal how deeply sleep and culture were entwined. You sink back into the warmth straw rustling under you, and now the night feels steady again. But before the household truly drifts into slumber, voices rise softly, stories. For Vikings, bedtime wasn't just about sleep. It was about passing on sagas, weaving myth and memory into the smoky air so children would fall asleep with heroes and gods in their heads. The mainstream fact storytelling was central to Viking culture. With no written sagas until centuries later, the oral tradition kept myths alive. Families gathered around the hearth even at night to hear fragments of tales of Thor battling giants, of Odin wandering in disguise, of Freya searching for her husband. These weren't always grand recitals. Sometimes they were quiet retellings, half-whispered as children dozed. The longhouse was both bedroom and theatre. The quirky tidbit is that these stories weren't only about gods and battles. They included local gossip disguised as fables, jokes woven into myths and lessons about daily chores. A mother might turn a bedtime tale into a warning about leaving tools out in the rain, and that's how the careless farmer angered the land spirit. You half asleep would soak up both entertainment and reminders, history blended with housekeeping. Historians still debate how much of the great sagas were told in everyday homes versus only in gatherings of skalds, poets. Were children really falling asleep to full-length Eddic verses, or just shortened versions adapted like lullabies? Some argue that epic recitation was rare in family settings. Others believe fragments of these tales seeped into every household, scaled down for smaller firesides. The argument continues, leaving us to imagine both epic poems for feasts, simpler tales for bedtime. The sensory motif here is voice. You hear it steady and low, weaving through the smoky rafters. The storyteller pauses now and then, letting the crackle of the fire fill the silence, then resumes words rolling like the tide. Outside, the storm has quieted to a soft hiss against the thatch, making the voice even clearer. It's hypnotic, like the gentle rhythm of waves or the ringing of distant bells. And there's humour, of course. Imagine drifting to sleep as your father tries to tell a noble tale of Odin's wisdom, only to pause mid-sentence and sneeze from the smoke, or your little brother chiming in with his own improvements to the story. Suddenly Thor's hammer is also a goat feeder. Even in the mythic, there's room for everyday comedy. So you close your eyes, stories humming in your ears, and the line between myth and reality blurs. You're half in the longhouse, half in Asgard, walking beside gods through snowy forests. Dreams and sagas blend seamlessly, but sagas and stories weren't the only thing shaping sleep. The Vikings also had practical remedies for the discomforts of the night, remedies that were sometimes sensible, sometimes peculiar, and occasionally downright odd. You stir in the straw, your back stiff from the planks beneath, and realise that even in the best furs, sleep wasn't always comfortable. Vikings like you had their tricks to make it more bearable, small remedies passed down through families blending folk wisdom with practical ingenuity. The mainstream fact Viking households used natural materials to ease aches, ward off pests, and calm restless nights. Herbs like juniper, thyme, and mint were scattered in bedding not only for their scent, but for their supposed ability to drive away fleas and spirits alike. Archaeological traces of plant matter in bedding layers hint that this wasn't rare. So as you settle into the straw, you might smell the faint sharpness of juniper, a medieval attempt at both aromatherapy and pest control. The quirky tidbit. Some families place charms or objects under pillows, smooth stones, carved bits of wood, even animal bones believed to guard against nightmares. Imagine drifting off only to have a knobbly little talisman poking your ear. Comfort questionable, but the reassurance was real. And for sore muscles after long days of farm work or rowing, families sometimes applied warm compresses of moss or cloth soaked in animal fat. Yes, you heard that right. Viking nighttime spa treatment was essentially grease yourself cozy. Here's the scholarly debate: how widespread were these remedies, and how much of it is reconstructed guesswork? Written sources from later periods describe herbal and magical practices, but evidence from the Viking Age itself is fragmentary. Some historians argue that everyday sleep aids were common knowledge woven into household routines. Others caution that what we imagine as nightly rituals might have been occasional, or tied to specific ailments. The truth probably lies in between a mix of practical herb use and sporadic superstition depending on the family. The sensory motif here becomes smell again. You breathe deeply, smoke still lingers, but beneath it drifts the faint spicy aroma of the herbs crushed into the bedding. It mingles with the musky wool of the pelts and the sharper tang of tarred wood. Strange layered, a cocktail of scents that's oddly grounding. The longhouse becomes a giant diffuser, half comforting, half overwhelming. Humour sneaks in easily. Imagine tucking in a child who squirms and complains. This straw is itchy, and the parent responds, "Don't worry, I sprinkled some cow fat and juniper, you'll be fine. Try selling that as a bedtime lotion today." You stretch feeling the prickly straw under your arm and wonder how much was placebo and how much was real. Either way, it worked well enough for them to keep using it. And when remedies, charms, and stories all came together, sleep finally claimed the longhouse in full. But before dawn, something else shaped Viking sleep the sheer length of the night. For in the far north, darkness itself was a season, and winter stretched bedtime longer than you might expect. The longhouse is quiet now, save for the occasional cough or the sigh of the goats. You've drifted in and out all night, but suddenly you realise the dark has stretched on and on far longer than what you're used to. This is winter in the north, where night itself becomes a season. The mainstream fact in Viking Age Scandinavia, the farther north you lived, the longer the winter nights. In December and January, daylight could be little more than a dim grey twilight for just a few hours. Families spent enormous stretches of time indoors, sleeping more, waking for chores, then sliding back into bed. Winter wasn't just about cold, it was about endless dark shaping rhythms of sleep into something fluid and extended. The quirky tidbit. Some scholars think Vikings used this extra darkness as a time for storytelling craftwork and quiet rituals. The sagas might not mention bedtime knitting circles, but archaeological finds of spindle whorls and bone tools suggest long nights were perfect for handwork by firelight. Sleep was interrupted by these activities, turning night into both rest and productivity. Imagine waking at what you think is dawn, only to realise it's still hours until the sun peeks over the horizon, so you roll over, mutter, and drift back again. And the scholarly debate: were Vikings truly hibernating in winter, sleeping for far longer stretches, or did their activity just shift indoors? Some historians propose that people may have slept 10 or more hours in midwinter. Others caution that while sleep lengthened, there was still plenty of work to do: animals to feed, tools to repair, sagas to rehearse. So while sleep may have dominated the season, it was never uninterrupted. The sensory motif here is darkness itself. Not the city dark, you know, where street lamps leak through curtains, but deep, absolute velvety dark. You feel it pressing in through the thatch, blanketing the longhouse in shadow. The only break comes from the faint red shimmer of embers pulsing like a heartbeat, and the rhythm of breathing all around you. It's a stillness that is both eerie and comforting, as if time itself has slowed. Humour sneaks in even here. Picture a Viking child complaining, "Is it morning yet?" only for their mother to reply, "Go back to sleep, the sun still owes us 3 hours." It's the medieval version of daylight savings, except without clocks, and without any hope of escaping it. So you curl tighter under your pelt, accepting the endless dark as part of life. Sleep comes in layers broken and resumed, carried by warmth, stories, charms, and sheer endurance. For Viking families, this was survival, not grand feasts, not heroic battles, but the simple nightly victory of making it through the cold without freezing to death. And as the last ember flickers, the longhouse exhales a quiet wooden sigh. The storm has passed. Dawn will come eventually. For now, all that matters is the slow rhythm of breath in the dark carrying you finally into real sleep. And so the night in the Viking longhouse comes to a gentle close. The fire, once a crackling centre of life, has dwindled into a faint bed of ash, glowing softly like tired eyes that refuse to shut completely. The goats have settled, the coughs have faded, and even the wind outside has grown weary, brushing the walls with nothing more than a lazy hand. You can picture yourself still lying there, buried beneath layers of wool and fur straw, cradling your weight in its uneven embrace. The air is smoky, yes, and the pelts itch faintly, but none of that matters anymore. Your body feels heavy, anchored by warmth, by the closeness of family, by the rhythm of breath filling the longhouse. In that closeness, there's a strange peace, the reassurance that you're not alone, that survival is shared, and that even the simplest axe sleep was a kind of triumph in a world of storms and endless night. As you let that image settle, you feel time slowing down. Every sound softens, every breath lengthens. The dark outside the walls grows less menacing and more like a blanket wrapping the house wrapping you. The sagas, the charms, the smells of herbs and tar, they blur into one gentle haze like fragments of dreams you can't quite remember but don't need to. Let your breathing grow steady. Imagine the fire's last warmth brushing your face, the silence of snow muffling the world, the soft press of furs tucking you in. There is no rush, no duty left for tonight. The Vikings endured their winters by surrendering to the rhythm of dark and light, of waking and sleeping, and so can you. And as the final ember fades, so too does the noise of the day. What's left is calm stillness and the simple gift of rest.